Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. The second of a double bill today, but you have got tomorrow off. There's nothing tomorrow. Then it's two more shows on Thursday, so you can all recover and do something else and watch the football tomorrow without fear of missing anything. But anyway, James Daly is back to expand on his research into the planned airborne operations after June the 6th. His book is listed, of course, in the description below, and I'm looking forward to discussing these fascinating what-if scenarios and what he found out since last time. So I'll bring you in now. Good evening, James. How are you today?
Good evening, Woody. Very good, thank you.
So the interesting thing is when you were on the first time, the book was kind of on the way, but you were still compiling things, and now it's out and it's going to be a 2-volume study. So remind us what the 2 volumes cover and how the process was for you.
So the whole project covers airborne operations between DDay and Arnhem that didn't happen. The fabled operations that Boy Browning refers to in Big Bridge Too Far about, and now the party's on those operations. I've been researching them for about 10 years after a flash of inspiration I had looking for a new research topic. But the research ended up being so weighty that the publishers rather wisely split it into 2 volumes. So the first volume covers Normandy and Brittany, that's been published, and the second volume covering the rest of France and the Low Countries up to Arnhem, that comes out at the end of August.
Brilliant stuff. And as we were discussing before going live, these planned airborne operations, they kind of range from kind of vague conversations in a pub about what could be done to actually men being ready inside aircraft and gliders. Did you have any parameters for what you would include and what you wouldn't include?
I think essentially if there was some evidence of it in a war diary or a document, because that means that you're able to research it and to put something together about it. And there are, for example, some accounts in veterans' oral histories or memoirs that refer to other operations,
right? Yeah,
that could have been talked about, but there's no documentary proof for them. So it's very hard to, whether that's veterans sort of recollecting things a little bit differently 40 odd years on, I don't know. But essentially, if there was a body of material to research about it and to try and form some sort of conclusion, then it's in.
And it's a great indication of just how much stuff was kept in the war, because people say, oh, there wasn't that many archives and there's nothing left in the German archives. But the fact that there is archives of stuff that didn't happen is really quite fascinating. You might have think at some point they'd have gone, oh, let's just get rid of that. We don't need it anymore. But the fact that you were able to find such incredible archives about these operations that, as we making clear, never actually happened is really testament to the archivists out there, I guess.
Yeah, and I've got to give a plug for Simon True, who used to lecture at Sandhurst, who I remember a talk he gave at the D-Day story about 10 years ago about, oh no, not Normandy again, what new is there to learn? And I think Simon very eloquently displayed that what we know about Normandy in D-Day is actually using a relatively small tranche of what is actually available. So if you look at the National Archives catalogue in the relevant WO series, there are thousands and thousands of references that have either not been looked at for a very long time or might not have been looked at all. So there is a lot of scope for new research on different angles or radical re-examination of things that other people have already looked at.
Yeah, well, I just had to give a shout out to Simon True myself, because he's been being invaluable with the book project I'm working on, and said, oh, I've got these 10,000 pages of archives, come over and we'll spend the weekend in the pub looking at them, which is fantastic. But we'll bring your PowerPoint up and we'll go through these various operations. You know the score, folks. Fire away with your questions. Obviously, there will be some that James probably can't answer, because there's lots. We're going into the what if territory, because these operations didn't happen, but we'll happily deal with them as we go along. But basically, over to you, James, to take us through the things that didn't happen between June and August.
Okay, well, thank you, Woody, and great to have you all with us tonight. Great to be back again after my last talk a few years ago. Some of you may well have seen that. That, as we mentioned earlier, that covered the period from June to early September. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about roughly about 11 days from D-Day to D+11. So from a wide range of operations, we're talking about the very immediate period just after D-Day. And it'll be clear, I hope, that there's an awful lot going on, or not going on, as the case may be, in such a relatively short space of time. Now, this is a picture that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Pegasus Bridge, early hours of D-Day, the Ox and Bucks light infantry land in a coup de main to capture the bridge. I think in general, I don't propose to go into detail here, but I think in general, most of us would agree that the airborne operations on D-Day, by and large, achieved their strategic aims in terms of securing the flanks and generally making things difficult for the Germans. I think, generally they're very well rehearsed, very well planned, and a very, very strong use of the element of surprise. So they tick lots of boxes for being almost textbook airborne operations. But then, just over 3 months later, we get to hear at Arnhem, the 1st Airborne Division virtually ceases to exist after Operation Market Garden. Now, again, Arnhem is something we could spend a long, long time talking about. I don't propose to go over all of those arguments here, but I'm sure that most of you are aware that the general outline of an operation where plenty of things went wrong. It's been described as a catalogue of errors and all sorts of things like that. But by and large, I think we would say that Market Garden and Arnhem not as successful as Pegasus Bridge and the D-Day airborne operations. And it always occurred to me, how do you go from Pegasus Bridge to Arnhem in just over 3 months when it's essentially the same people, not the actual same people doing it, but it's the same planners and the same hierarchy? How do you forget so many lessons in such a short time, or not even absorb the lessons at all? That had always really intrigued me. I must confess to having a slight, more than a passing interest in airborne operations in 1944. My granddad served in the 11th Parachute Battalion at Arnhem. He was wounded and captured as a POW. For those of you in the know, he was actually in the Chinoord when it was liberated and then recaptured again. So he was always proud of telling everyone that he was a POW twice. He's the little guy third from the left. And you might recognise the little guy in the right-hand photo. That's me looking a lot younger. So he died when I was 12. But it was fascinating hearing, even at that age, about these amazing stories and hearing about what happened to him. He didn't talk about it much, again, because most of you may well know that the 11th Battalion had a pretty horrible time at Arnhem. So I think it's common that the veterans of that battalion really didn't talk about their experiences all that much. So that always left an intrigue in me wanting to find out a bit more about what happened to him. Having worked at the D-Day story in Portsmouth as well, I developed quite a strong interest in D-Day. So anything that links D-Day and Arnhem's, or I always find quite interesting, because I think there is possibly a tendency to see them as being separate campaigns, when actually there is a thread linking them. So I always wanted to do something about the 1944 campaign, but it was quite hard thinking about what new is there that I could do that could add to the historiography, rather than just going over old ground. And again, I'm sure this is an image familiar to many of you. The Bridge Too Far, the film that stars absolutely everybody and inspires thousands of quotes, Bring Up the Piet, all of that. In the film, Boy Browning has an argument with his intelligence officer, Brian Urquhart, who had identified tanks in the undergrowth around Arnhem. And Browning refers to, in the film, there being numerous cancelled operations, but this time the party's on. And I remember watching the film and thinking, what were these operations? We don't know anything about them, yet they've clearly had such a big impact on making something happen that seemed quite risky. So they must have had quite an influence. So,
as you said earlier, James, every airborne memoir, I was going through my 82nd and 101st books this afternoon, they all make mention at some point in June or July of, we were already, there was rumors of us doing this, there was rumors of doing this, that, and it was something that I think anybody who's read about World War II, there was always this understanding that there were these things, these mythological operations that so we never knew anything about them. That was until you did your work, basically.
Yeah, and I think looking back, it amazes me how most historians had got their numbers completely different of how many there were. Even some of the veterans' memoirs after the war, even Roy Urquhart and John Frost recalled them very differently. And I think we need to make allowances for 40 years of meant 40, 50 years of memory and whatever happened in between. But I think that shows how something that clearly had a big impact on the campaign actually was almost did, like you say, Woody, did almost have a slightly mythical nature. And I think, Browning's also quite interesting here because he's possibly one of the most controversial of airborne generals. But he actually has quite a relatively low profile in these operations we're going to talk about tonight. That's pretty much because 6th Airborne, who've done the D-Day drop, they work directly to Crocker in their planning, and Browning only has a watching brief. Right. So Browning doesn't really have a huge role. And at this point, he's not an operational corps commander. He's Commander Airborne Troops for 21st Army Group, in the same way that it has a Commander Royal Armoured Corps or Commander Royal Engineers. That changes as the campaign goes on. But the period we're talking about here, Browning's actually relatively out of the picture, but that will change as the campaign develops. So another character who comes up quite a lot is Roy Urquhart here, the commander of the 1st Airborne Division. 6th Airborne Division had been formed specifically for D-Day back in 1943, and it was planned from the start that 6th Airborne would do D-Day itself, and the 1st Airborne would be the emergency airborne division that was held back either for an emergency or for exploitation. And 1st Airborne were brought back from the Mediterranean specifically for that. Urquhart, I always think, strikes me as such not a hapless character, that's not quite the right word, but a really, really unfortunate person stuck in a horrible circumstance, because he's an extremely experienced general. He's been GSO1 of 51st Highland Division in North Africa, commanded an independent brigade in Sicily, was BGS of a corps. So he's got tons of experience, even though he's not airborne. And this is something that does come up in the histories where it's said that he's new to airborne, but actually even the people that had been with airborne for a year or two, you could argue, were relatively new to airborne, because airborne's such a new concept at the time. But at this stage, as I mentioned, Browning's HQ airborne troops hadn't quite morphed into an operational corps. So Urquhart is not just during this period, but all the way from June to September, is really bearing the brunt of lots of these operations and the planning, and he's having to keep his division together and ready and trained, but also plan these things that then don't happen or might not. So he's probably the general I feel the most empathy for, in a way, because he's clearly a very experienced and very capable commander. But it's impossible not to think, when you're thinking about these operations, what was the impact on the men of the division, the staff officers, and particularly Urquhart. It must have been an absolutely thankless task at the time.
We have a quick question, James, already, which I think might set things up. Not wrong one. From Great Dominion, there is what was the combat status of the 1st British Airborne at the time of D-Day? Were companies at full strength? Because we're talking about there being an emergency kind of firefighting force. Is it ready to go?
It's on paper, yes. I think if you look at the strength when they take off for Arnhem, most of it is slightly under strength, and I think that's partly a reflection of the fact that you've got 2 airborne divisions, and you've possibly soaked up most of the willing volunteers, and also there's the general manpower crisis in the British Army up before and after D-Day. So there are several levels there where it's ready, but not as ready as it could be, if that makes sense. And also there is generally a perception that it was fighting fit and at a razor's edge. I think that William Buckingham, for example, has done a lot of research and looking at the training of some of those battalions in that period. And you can argue quite convincingly that being stood to for operations, then stood down again, gets in the way of training that would have been ideal given the chance. So I think Urquhart, in his memoirs after the war, referred to them as being absolutely wonderful individual material, but the units and formations hadn't exercised together as much as they could have done ideally. So 6th Airborne, for example, before D-Day, have got months to rehearse almost in an absolute set-piece fashion. 1st Airborne just don't get that opportunity.
And it's a good point that we know that all the Allied divisions that we know eventually came through Normandy, they all know that they are the ground divisions, on a kind of a conveyor belt at some point. They all know that they will be funneled in. It's not a question of if, it's a question of just when. And certainly for the ones soon after D-Day, it's going to order. So units on the American sector, like the 83rd Division and the 9th, they know when they're coming in. The same would apply in the British sector, like the 49th and the 59th. They know that they're coming in. But the 1st Airborne have this weird, well, you might be used, and you might be used like tomorrow, or you might not be used at all. It's a weird situation to be in.
Yeah, I mean, psychologically, that's very, very different to, say, an infantry division who probably marshal, go to the embarkation point, travel over, disembark, probably some time de-waterproofing and all of that. There's much more of a process, whereas for the Airborne Division, it's very instant, but then it isn't. So it's a very different psychology, which is fascinating.
Yeah. No,
so my new book, which is out now, focuses on airborne operations between D-Day and the end of the Battle of Normandy. They effectively fall into two phases. You've got operations in and associated with the Normandy bridgehead, and then Brittany. I talked a little bit about Brittany very briefly in my previous talk a few years ago. I'm not going to go into that tonight because that's a whole other story. But it should be clear, I think, at least that, we're looking at 6-7 operations here in the course of 2 months. So I think it should be clear at least that there's a lot going on in a very short space of time, even in terms of planning and, the staff office having a rather torrid time. So even before D-Day, there are some exercises that we can find that shed some light on what was being fought in terms of how to use airborne troops. Exercise Wake was held by O'Connor's 8th Corps on the 8th of May, and that was ordered by Dempsey, who always comes across as in my research, as a much more engaging commander than he has often done in the historiography. He's very much a thinker about airborne forces. Obviously, I think Sicily has a big influence on that when he commands airborne aspects of the operation. So the purpose of Wake is not so much to try and actually exercise what they thought might happen, but to work out the planning process and the coordination between the airborne and the ground forces, because obviously there's a lot to coordinate. You've got the airborne force, you've got the air transport, you've got the ground forces who are going to link up. There's an awful lot to work out. So it was quite far-sighted of them to exercise this. But it's quite interesting, the scenario that they put together for the exercise, where it was assumed that Second Army had reached south of Caen somewhere around 10 to 14 days after D-Day. 1st Airborne Division were to be dropped somewhere on the Caen to Falaise road, and then 15th Scottish Division would do the break-in, effectively breaking through the front line. Then 11th Armoured Division would start the advance, which would be followed by a general advance. So this is just a tabletop exercise, and it would be possible to read too much into it, and some historians have in the past, I think, read too much into it and viewed it as something that was actually going to happen. I think my analysis would be, it's interesting that scenario is in someone's mind. I wouldn't read much more than that into it. And crucially, it doesn't address what's happening on the rest of the front. So the maps only show up to sort of Bayeux, for example. So we don't know what else is going on, what other assumptions are there. And it also shows that Dempsey was clearly thinking about 8th Corps as being the breakthrough corps. And they were used as such for Epsom and Goodwood. So we know that 8th Corps and O'Connor, it backs up that they were being viewed very much in having this role. And at the Thunderclap briefing in May before D-Day as well, Dempsey had highlighted that he saw 1st Airborne Division as being the key part of the breakout. So again, Dempsey comes across as much more of a thinker, much more innovative and creative. He's often seen as being a bit of a Montgomery lackey. That's certainly not the Dempsey that I've found in the research that I've done. So Operations Tuxedo and Wastage, the first 2 operations, those are planned as reinforcement operations before D-Day. Dempsey asks for them pretty much, I think, as a contingency if the weather disrupts the flow of reinforcement across the channel, or there's a particular emergency that means they need to get infantry over quickly in a way that they couldn't achieve by sea. The difference between them, there's very little difference. One of them would just be Hackett's 4th Brigade. The other one would be divisional level. There's not a huge difference. These operations couldn't start until the airfields and camps had cleared after D-Day. So the same air transport aircraft would be using the same airfields and the same marshalling camps as they did for D-Day. So they would take time to clear those and for the aircraft to be turned around. So it was assumed that these wouldn't take place until at least D+2 onwards for the brigade level operation, then D+6 onwards for the division level. And the image that you've got here in front of you is a map trace that I found in HQ Airborne Troops files, and it shows a whole number of landing areas that had been pre-selected in Normandy before D-Day, which is absolutely fascinating. Someone's gone round and measured them all up. I think looking at where they are, and I'll show you another image in a minute which shows a little bit more detail, but I think this is very much planned as a reinforcement rather than an operational jumping into action drop. The fact that the airborne are told during the planning for this one that you won't know where you're going to land until you get to the airfield, and you might not get any maps until you land. I think that kind of suggests that it's a reinforcement thing, really, rather than operational. And it could also have simply been developed as a contingency, so it was ready if they needed it. And there could also be the aspect that it's to get the airborne forces and their command chain into the practice of planning and getting ready and all of that.
I mean, it makes sense just to have that database of what could be used as a drop zone, just like that we know that they had worked out where all the water sources were in Normandy, all the areas that could be useful for airfields. It's the kind of in-depth planning that Overlord had kind of uniquely, really, when we've done our Anzio and Salerno weeks where they were kind of put together in a matter of almost hours, but certainly days and weeks. This is the kind of luxury, I suppose, you have when you're planning something for as long as Overlord is. You might as well have someone in a department just look at that geography and go, okay, what would be feasible areas for drop zones? And then that can go through to people as you've been doing the work on, if that need arises.
Yeah, and I think that it seems like a lot of work, but actually in real terms, for somebody to sit down with a map and a map trace and draw, highlight some good looking drop zones and landing zones actually isn't a huge amount of work. It's probably far better to have that ready than for someone to be scrabbling around trying to do it at short notice, which we find out the implications of that later on in the campaign, where you want to launch an airborne operation for a couple of days' notice and you don't have any information about where it's going to land. That inevitably affects the planning. But I spent absolutely ages transposing the map trace onto Google Earth, and also using the wonderful Echo Delta converter that is available in terms of converting old map references to new. I had a great time doing this, and I think it's interesting seeing just how many potential landing zones there are in the British sector. They're fairly well spread out, so they're covering all bases. And the vast majority are in territory that either was captured on D-Day or at least was meant to be according to the objectives. So again, it backs up that this was intended very much as a reinforcement thing to get infantry over quickly. Yeah, it's just interesting as well, reflecting on those of us who know Normandy, how many areas of it actually make quite ideal drop zones in terms of having rather flat, clear, wide open arable land, which is absolutely ideal for landing airborne forces. That's not always the case with some of the other targets that we look at in some of these operations.
Yeah, and it also just reminds us how much importance was on building those supplies in. We've had questions already about whether any airborne plans to take channel ports, for example, because a lot of faith has been put in getting to Cherbourg and the Mulberry Harbours working and the weather being cooperative as the summer goes on. So it's interesting to think that they are really thinking about maintaining that logistical advantage, because everything, the Allies have got all the stuff, but we always say in the channel, it's in England. You've got to get it to France somehow, and having a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, there are definitely some of these airborne operations, not necessarily the ones we're talking about tonight, but the Brittany operations are all about logistics. They're all about capturing deep water ports so you can bring men and material straight from America. There are some operations later on looking at like the Channel Ports, Boulogne, and Operation Infatuate at Walker, and is aimed at clearing the Scheldt. So yeah, I mean, logistics is a huge part of this.
Thank you.
So there are, amongst those drop zones that were identified in the planning, there are 3 in particular that were given a very high level of priority. They were coloured in a different colour. And just to identify where they are, you've got this one here that's just south of Vers-sur-Mer, about a mile inland from Gold Beach. You've got this one here, which is just northeast of Banville. Again, that's probably a couple of miles inland from Juno. And then you've got this one here at just near Saint-Auban, which again is south of Sword Beach. That's actually quite close to the sea, that one.
I was literally stood there about 3 days ago doing one of my watches. That's right in the area that 21st Panzer moved through. So it's absolutely open, flat. Well, not quite flat, but certainly really open. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So it's interesting again that there's one identified for pretty much to correspond to every British/Canadian beach, which again suggests that they're planned that if there's a problem in this sector, that's where we're going to land them. And it's again, as I mentioned, the fact that you look at this map and you see actually there's tons of potential landing areas just inland from the beach. So the other operation we're going to talk about, and we'll be talking about it for a fair bit tonight, Wild Oats. This is probably the most controversial of the airborne operations, certainly the ones that were considered for Normandy and Brittany. Wild Oats is normally assumed to have arose after D-Day, but it actually existed in airborne circles as a code for a divisional level drop as part of the breakout from the beachhead. In a relatively loose way, there weren't any locations identified, there weren't any other organisations that they'd be working, units they'd be working with. It's fairly loose, just to allow them to plan and make some assumptions. But the fact that it's breakout gives a good understanding of what they were thinking. Presumably that allows them to then adapt the plan depending on the exact circumstances. This image in front of you was adapted from an air transport plan that I found in the RAF files at Kew, and it's dated the 3rd of June, and it shows the air transport routes that were used for D-Day, but also the transport routes that would be used for Wastage, Tuxedo, or Wild Oats. Now, Wastage and Tuxedo, we can see those, the run that goes almost behind the beaches. That's almost certainly for Wastage and Tuxedo. But if you look, there's another route that goes down towards Falaise. Now, it's not labelled as such on the map, the original map either, but that bears a very strong resemblance to Exercise Wake that we just looked at. Whether the two are conflated, it's very difficult to tell, but it's hard not to think that without there being any evidence of it, particularly circumstantially, it feels like Wild Oats is almost seen in some quarters at this point as being the implementation of Exercise Wake. So we know that progress after D-Day clearly altered the Allied plans. Was it ever fuss with military campaigns, with the rate of progress and the rate of reinforcement being slower than anticipated? For example, 8 Corps and O'Connor were meant to be doing the breakout to, follow on and then break through after D-Day, but by 10th of June they were still to arrive, and still some time to arrive after. This famous meeting on the 10th of June, where Montgomery met his army commanders Bradley and Dempsey, that seems to have played quite a big part in the discussions about what's going to happen. I've always been amused by this picture about the cows in the background who look so nonplussed. It was really not fussed at all about what's going on. But amongst other things, they definitely discussed Operation Perch and Wild Oats. Operation Perch is another interesting operation where I had a look at both Dempsey and Bucknell's correspondence. Part of Dempsey's is in the National Archives, part is at the Imperial War Museum, and Bucknell's is at the Imperial War Museum. And it's hard not to escape the conclusion they really didn't like each other all that much, and particularly after the war. But they both claimed that Perch and Wild Oats were their idea. But Dempsey's diary suggests that he told Bucknell to keep 7th Armoured Division ready for an operation to break out of the beachhead on the 8th of June, which is the earliest mention of the implementation of Operation Perch / Wild Oats. And then on 9th of June, Montgomery writes to his confidant at the War Office, Simpson, who's the Director of Military Operations, explaining that he'd ordered Dempsey to go for Caen via Villers-Bocage. So well before Villers-Bocage, this is being talked about. Wild Oats exists as a concept before D-Day. So already we can see that it stretches back much further than we might originally assume. So this is a map from the 30 Corps Intelligence Summary on the 9th of June. And this shows the situation on the 9th of June, or at least the situation that the Allies thought pertained on the 9th of June. They'd identified a gap around Caen, while the front was already starting to congeal around Caen. And there is they definitely thought, I think, that there was a window of opportunity before the front line hardened too much. And looking at this, you can already see that the Panzer divisions are being pulled into the front line. You've got Panzer Lehr, 12 SS Panzer, 21st Panzer. So on the one hand, you've got these Panzer divisions being pulled into the front line around Caen, but also there's a gap opening around Caumont. So potentially that's a very fluid and very a situation that gives lots of opportunities.
And it's really weird, James, because I didn't plan this, but I've had 3 shows in the last few days that have all kind of ended up talking about this gap. And I was trying to focus on things that are happening after D-Day. And so there was the one with Gregory Fontenot last week about the 1st Division pushing in for it. Will Hogan was on yesterday talking about American 3rd Armored Division kind of in that Caumont, Auvent area. And now it's coming up again. It's almost like I planned all this, but it's completely accidental. It's just worked out really good.
Well, I think it does feel like a very narrow window of opportunity, and that's something that, again, is a theme that's shared with airborne forces. The window of opportunity for using them is so small, but that's the situation that pertained on the 9th of June, and you can see that there's a feeling that there could be an opportunity here.
And that's one of the things that came up in the sidebar, James, is that obviously people are discussing in the ground divisions, they're looking at possibilities ahead of them and opportunities, and they're having all sorts of meetings and O groups about what's happening there. But I guess on the ground, you can kind of implement a plan pretty quickly. You can say, okay, this afternoon, we're going to head our infantry brigade for that hill over there. But an airborne operation, as you say there, you can't just, press a button and have paratroopers landing exactly where you need them. You've got to get your aircraft ready. You've got to get people together. So it's really fascinating that we think of paratroopers as being this kind of speedy, swift, new technology, which it is. But at the same time, weirdly, paradoxically, it takes longer to get an operation together because of the speed with which they do their jobs. The time has to be done in preparing to get them there. I think I explained that more or less how my brain put that sentence together in my head. But it's fantastic. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great sort of analysis of it. That on the one hand, you have these windows of opportunity that might last for a day, hours even, but it takes a lot longer than that to fly across the channel. It takes a lot longer than that to marry up 10,000 men into however 100 many aircraft. There's an awful lot of organisation, like the air movement tables and things like that. It's huge. I mean, the staff work behind airborne operations is really, really extensive. And I think that's often something that doesn't quite come across in existing histories. I mentioned Operation Perch without actually explaining too much about what it was. Perch is planned by 30 Corps before D-Day. It doesn't just happen on D plus whatever. Bucknell recorded before D-Day that he intended to use 7th Armoured Division to break out from D+4 onwards. But there's no evidence in Bucknell's planning that he planned to use airborne forces. Perch was initially planned as a pincer movement with 51st Highland Division advancing from east of Caen. So what we know now, or what we perceive now as being a division level operation, or effectively a sort of a regimental armoured regiment sort of operation, was actually planned as a you know, a 2-division pincer movement with an airborne division landing as part of it. So it was a much bigger, much weightier operation. And I think sometimes we lose that when we look at Villers Bocage and Perch and what actually happened. And the early plan was the airborne division would be dropped with whichever division made the most progress. And I think I mentioned earlier there were big arguments between Dempsey and Buckland about whose idea it was, Perch and Wild Oats. I think it's fair to say that they weren't big fans of each other. That's fairly clear. So what I mentioned earlier that Wild Oats had been planned before D-Day. Originally, it was planned that it would happen in collaboration with 8 Corps. And Wild Oats was actually ordered by Brown, or the Airborne Division was ordered to plan Wild Oats on the 24th of May by Browning. So it's well before D-Day. Wild Oats exists as a concept at least a couple of weeks before. And in the same memo, Browning mentioned to Urquhart and his staff to look at D+7/8, an area 8 miles north of Falaise, which again sounds very similar to what we've looked at for Operation Exercise Wake. This map trace here from 30 Corps again shows the front line, and it identifies again 12 SS Panzer and the 21st Panzer Division. And there's this area E here, which identifies the area that the Airborne Division were meant to be dropped during Wild Oats. So we mentioned earlier about planning. So just to give an idea of how complex this is, a planning team from 1st Airborne Division, who were based around the East Midlands, flew to Normandy on the 10th of June to work with 30 Corps and Dempsey to plan Wild Oats. Something else that's quite interesting that I found that I don't think I've read anywhere before is that 51st Highland Division's plan for Wild Oats, if it had happened in collaboration with them, would have been called Operation Smock, which I think again is a clear indication of the fact that it was planned to be a airborne operation. So 51st Highlands operation order for Smock doesn't include any maps, unfortunately, but it does tell us that their initial objectives would have been Verrières, Bulgibus and Cagny as objectives. Again, areas that we're well familiar with from Goodwood. But the 51st Highland Division option is very quietly dropped after the Highlanders had difficulty breaking out from the Yorn bridgehead. And, you know, that's again another complete story, isn't it, about divisions coming from the Mediterranean and having a hard time in Normandy.
Quick question about the maps, like you're on screen there. Ian is asking, are these maps signed or initialed to establish who created them?
The originals, some yes, some no. Some of the shorter planned operations, they are map traces, so it's tracing paper with some outlines on, and that's very, very roughly done. Some of the other operations, not necessarily these ones, but some of the other operations that I've looked at in Brittany, for example, it's so extensive that you've got a name, date, pretty much everything you could want about it. It's really, really extensive. And I think that's one thing that actually really struck me, that some of these operations are so rushed, and yet some of them haven't a huge amount of planning going into them. There's a real variance in it. So this map shows the planned drop zones and objectives for Wild Oats. I know it looks like there's an awful lot happening in a short space, and I think that's actually a really key point about this. The division would have landed in one day, starting from 0400 hours. The longer daylight time in mid-June would have allowed for 2 drops in one day. And I think another thing to bear in mind is that you're actually not travelling as far. From England to Normandy is much shorter than, say, from England to Holland or even to Brittany. Yeah. So actually that buys you a bit of time to be able to do 2 drops in one day. I think one thing that's very, very clear when you look at this is it's focused very much on the road network. So key towns such as Evreysey, Gavras and Baron and Bougie, they're all crossroad towns, or they're all key towns on the road network. And thinking about those maps that we've looked at before, if the Airborne Division had dropped around here and the Armoured Division had been able to link up with them, they're essentially creating a pocket, and holding these road towns would block the Germans from withdrawing from the east and from the north. it's also quite clear looking at this that the drop zones and the objectives at most are a mile and a half away from each other. So very, very short distances, very quick acting, I would have thought. They're all in a very compact area. There's probably about 3 miles from one part of the airborne perimeter to the other. I think we know from Arnhem that distance is key. So, an airborne force that have got a mile to go is probably got much more chance than one that's got 8 miles to go. So clearly here they're thinking very much about surprise and lightning speed. And I think we know, don't we, from Arnhem. So when airborne forces do sit tight and hunker down, they can be incredibly difficult to shift. So it's tempting to think that they would be lightly armoured, but airborne forces could give a very good account of themselves.
And it's come up in the sidebar while that map is up there. Not sure how Paras would have helped with Hill 112, because that's right in the middle of that map there. Needs heavy stuff to deal with all the SS armor around there. But at the time this is being planned, all that SS armor isn't there yet, is it? So it's on its way, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, I think it's definitely on its way. And as we know from Villers-Bocage and Wittmann, we know that there are units being drawn to the front, but it's a very, very fluid situation where you suspect even the Germans don't know who's where on their lines and in their rear. So potentially that's a situation that they could have taken advantage of.
And that map there, for the people like David O'Keefe, who was watching earlier, those 3 towns on the right there, Fleury-sur-Orne, Saint-André-sur-Orne, and Maison, that's the heart of Verrières Ridge. That's the subject of his book, about the battle there in July. And then we know what happened at Hill 112, and it's almost, the Goodwood battlefield is almost on that there. Is you can't help as a military historian kind of thinking of the what ifs, and if they had done that, could ground divisions have come in, and could we have got that area there? How different would that have made the Battle of Normandy unfold? These are fascinating questions without any real ability to answer them.
Yeah, it's I think we were talking before, weren't we, Woody, that one of the great things about this is there's no absolutely right answers and there's no absolutely wrong answers. Short of wargaming it or holding tabletop exercises, a lot of this is speculation, and a lot of it's trying to make as good a guess as you can without really knowing for sure. I think Hill 112 particularly has it's one of those mythical places, isn't it, that it's difficult not to think it was that hard fought during Epsom. What would it have been like for an airborne division? But it's important to remember that this is before then, and the German situation looks very different.
I mean, we're not going to stop the German armored divisions arriving. Every effort is being made to hamper their movements by night. That's going to happen. But whether or not, if there had been, what was the proposed date for this, or date range for this?
Yeah, so I think the first potential date is the 12th of June. And it consecutively gets postponed and then cancelled. So there's a very, very big argument about this. So Lee Mallory, the air commander-in-chief, is very much not in favour. One of the things about the development of British armed airborne forces is that in order to secure the support of the Royal Air Force, the Army had effectively had to give them a veto over the launching of airborne operations. So the Air Force were basically able to say, no, we're not doing it, even if that didn't make strategic sense. So Williams and Hollingsworth, who were the troop carrier commanders for the Americans and the British respectively, they didn't want to fly in daylight. And also they didn't want to fly in darkness over a defended area because they were worried about friendly fire. And the Navy refused to hold their anti-aircraft fire in the Seine estuary. So you start to think, actually, if you're not going to let it happen in daylight and you're not going to let it happen at night and you're not allowed to fly over friendly naval forces, when are you going to let it happen? And it's difficult not to think that these are things that should really have been sorted out before D-Day, building this quite impressive airborne capability, but not actually being able to use it. And this is the situation that leads Montgomery to calling Lee Mallory a gutless bugger, famously. And I always find it interesting that actually they got on better than they realised after that. It was almost like a clearing of the air moment. But it's difficult not to have some sympathy with the airborne forces here, where this plan's been put together, and a fairly fundamental thing was sort of holding it up.
We'll just add David O'Keefe's comments on this because they're just worth putting up there. You think Arnhem was bad is the first slightly sarcastic one. Then he's saying can't see how paras would have been effective in this terrain, and then thank God this was cancelled. I mean, the airborne bit. Theoretically, as you said there, the drop zones make sense. They're close to their objectives. The fact that they're taking these bits of ground is important, but without reinforcing it, I'm trying to think who was available as early as June 12th or 13th to actually go and reinforce it. 7th Armoured are already engaged. Who else could the Allies have brought in to kind of bolster this defense? There's the 11th Armoured. I don't think are there yet, are they?
No. So I think the plan is that. I mean, I don't think I've mentioned this, actually. This is really one of the key points about this, that they would only land when the relieving force, in this case 7th Armoured, were either on the drop zones or close enough to them to be nearby. So it's not an Arnhem scenario where they're dropped and then they're holding out until relieved, to use Richard Todd's words. It's effectively dropping infantry reinforcements to bolster an armoured division that have landed. The tricky thing there is that the Airborne Division haven't trained at all with tanks. The 7th Armoured haven't trained at all with airborne forces. And we know from looking at some of the operations in Normandy that actually infantry armour cooperation does take a great deal of work to get right. And it does take a lot of relationship building and developing common understanding. So it's something that comes up a lot in veterans' accounts, that because of what happened at Arnhem with tanks and waiting for an armoured division to relieve them, it is very, very possible to compare Wild Oats to Arnhem, but there are some very key differences with it as well. And I must admit, I swing from thinking it's a daring idea to thinking it's a ludicrous idea, and it would be really interesting to see this war game, to see what happened with it. Really,
I mean, as you said, it's clear in some ways. It's clearly less risky than Market Garden because Allied units are much closer to support this, whereas Market Garden, famously, they're up that single road, how many miles away it is back in the Belgian border, whereas this, the beaches aren't that far away from this. We're only a couple of miles south of Caen here. So it's, 10 miles or so from there. So there's some intriguing whiffs of this could have done something. But at the same time, as David O'Keefe was saying, there's massive, great alarm bells of this could go completely tits up.
Yeah, it's I think it's interesting as well, thinking that the appearance of an airborne division can have a big effect on the morale of the Germans. So when we look at what happened at Arnhem, that the first day they started to get a handle on it, and then when the 4th Parachute Brigade lands, suddenly even the Germans think, okay, we're up against this now. So that can have a huge effect on morale. So if you're a German armoured unit in that pocket, and then suddenly you've got an armoured division coming up behind, and then an airborne division land, from a morale point of view, it's difficult to imagine, but I can't imagine that would be a good scenario to be in.
And again, especially because when we're talking about sort of June 12th, 13th, 14th, the caliber of German troops are still lower. The really good units haven't arrived. I mean, Panzer Lehr are engaging now, 12th SSR, but the 1st SS, 2nd SS, they're not there yet. You wonder what would have happened to some of the the Luftwaffe ground troops, things like that were in the area, if they'd heard that Allied paras are landing, because this is Market Garden hasn't happened. Our understanding that a British or Allied airborne operation can go wrong, that's not happened yet. So there's still this idea of the great successes of June the 6th, seizing of the bridge, the seizing of Merville Battery. So it is interesting that what would have happened to the Germans, their Germans' morale. But I mean, of course, these conversations are entirely, academic. We can't go anywhere with them, but they're fascinating to have.
And I think another thing is that airborne operations, by their very nature, need to be ambitious enough that they're worth doing, given the effort that they take and the resources, and the fact that it's a not a one-shot weapon, but once you've used it, it's going to take time to get it ready.
That's a really good point. There's no point using airborne for just pushing a mile down the road that you've got ground. You've got to be kind of bold with it. That's the. I mean, I'm going to use Cretan for Eben, MAR and those kind of things. They can either work spectacularly well or not, or fail. Some of the Red Army Soviet operations were incredibly ambitious, and some worked well and some went completely wrong. But you've kind of got to be bold.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you an impression of where that map was drawn from, this is in the 1st Airborne Division planning for Wild Oats. So you can see effectively it's a divisional hedgehog based on 3 brigade all round defensive positions. So you can see 1st Parachute Brigade on the left, the 4th Brigade in the middle, and then the Air Landing Brigade on the right with divisional HQ in the middle. But you can see the way the defences are set up, they're focused very much to the north. So you've got the divisional headquarters to the south, but it just feels to me like it's aimed at stopping units retreating rather than anything else. So I think that gives a bit of an indication as to what they're planning. Again, just to give you a bit of an idea of where we're at, the proximity to Hill 112. I always think it's amazing thinking about all of these different places. We view them in linked to a particular operation.
Yeah, what actually happened? Yeah.
It's so fascinating. It's difficult not to think what might Normandy have looked like if Wild Oats happens and if it succeeds. Both big ifs, of course. But if Hill 112 is in Allied hands, then Epsom doesn't happen how Epsom happened, and Caen's been outflanked to the west. So there's all sorts of different factors. I think really Wild Oats would have, if it had happened, assuming it would have happened, it would have formed an envelopment between Tilly, Villers-Bocage and Evrecy, which traps Panzer Lehr and a large part of 12 SS Panzer to, that doesn't seem like an impossible situation. It's hard not to see how, if that happened, the Germans don't have to withdraw, but then we know that they don't always do what they should do. So Lutic, for example. So, I mean, it's hard not to draw in all these other operations. And
we said before going live, James, it needs some war gamers to kind of take your book and kind of set up this scenario, look at which German units are coming in there, look at the ones already there, look at what the Allies have and say, and just kind of play out some scenarios. And just, I know that's not an exact science and it still is just kind of elaborate guessing, but it would be really interesting to see if there are any kind of workable versions of this, or whether they would all just completely go wrong. I mean, the sidebar is kind of unanimous in this. I'm glad this didn't happen, but it's fascinating. Yeah,
and I think again, like I said, I mean, one thing, knowing that your granddad would have taken part in it is another factor.
Yeah.
It's difficult not to think about it, and would it have worked? Wouldn't it have worked? I think that's a thing. If an operation would have been absolutely nailed on to succeed, then it wouldn't have been worth doing because it would have just happened anyway somehow. So there's all sorts of factors involved here. So we've talked about what didn't happen. In terms of what actually happened on the ground, the fact that 7th Armoured are effectively blunted at Villers-Bocage is when people assess Wild Oats, does come up very, very strongly because it's got such strong correlate with Arnhem and Hell's Highway and the amount of times that the Armoured Division were sort of stopped there. And veterans' accounts from the 1st Airborne Division very much look at Wild Oats as being an early version of Market Garden. Effectively, the Tiger tank aspect that comes up strongly, Panzers, and I think there are some key differences. So Villers-Bocage to Evrecy is 13 kilometres rather than 60 miles in Market Garden. The airborne would only have been dropped when the armoured were either on the drop zones or very, very close to them. And the division would have been operating in a very much more compact area than at Arnhem. So there are some key differences that it's important to bear in mind. And you could argue, I think, as well, that Perch feels very different if you had an airborne division to it.
Yeah.
It's a completely different situation. But then we also
and
know,
that's also because you said that the 51st were going to be the other side of the prong. That adds another element of potential interest to the Perch operation.
yeah, because I think then you've potentially got an advance coming towards Caen from the west. You've got Caen being outflanked from the east, an airborne division. That probably starts to feel quite chaotic in the German command, I would have thought. So I think, as much as Montgomery is often lambasted for being cautious, this is quite ambitious, actually. The broad idea behind Perch and Wild Oats is fairly ambitious.
Well, there were some historians that say that Montgomery was quite content to just sit there near Caen, let the Americans do all the fighting in the west, push up to Cherbourg, and then wait until he's got his resources. But as you say, this is showing that there are these possibly flawed, possibly futile, but interesting proposed ideas for things that would have maybe, in theory, brought a swifter end to the campaign.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we do need to bear in mind as well is, what Robert Kershaw brought to the Arnhem historiography about, what about the Germans? The Germans, we know, had a very strong capability of forming Kampfgruppen and the doctrine of the immediate counterattack, which was perfect for opposing airborne landings. So that's really important to bear in mind as well. That's difficult to assess because we don't know in a huge amount of detail who's where around this time behind the German lines. So that's really quite hard to factor in if we're wargaming as well. So again, I think I mentioned earlier, we talked in our previous talk that I did, Woody, that Montgomery is criticised for being reckless and cautious at the same time.
Paradoxically, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this doesn't feel cautious in a sort of creative way. It's certainly imaginative. That's one thing you can say about it. So what does this tell us about the wider campaign, really, trying to put it all together? I think 1st Airborne Division really had a thankless task where they're standing by for things that might happen or might not happen. That clearly has an impact on morale. We've just looked at a couple of operations here. If you multiply that from June to September, clearly that's going to have an effect. The window of opportunity for using airborne forces is very narrow. It's got to be ambitious enough to be worth doing, but it can't be too risky that you would lose the airborne force, so you couldn't use them again. So actually, it's like trying to thread cotton through the eye of a needle almost, really, and that probably contributes to why it takes so many operations to get them into action. There's also lots and lots of people involved in planning these. You've got the airborne force, you've got the ground forces, you've got the air forces. In some occasions, you've got the naval forces having an input too. And it's also multinational, maybe not for these operations specifically, but later on, you've got the Anglo-American aspect to it as well, which gets into it. So it's a very, very complex picture, all of this planning. And some of these challenges really should have been ironed out in advance. So whether to land in daylight or at night, that really should have been something that should have been sorted out before D+4 or whatever it was. That would have saved a lot of drama. But it's hard not to come to the conclusion that Arnhem has such a powerful influence on the historiography of this period. I mean, of course it would. Even Urquhart called Wild Oats aptly named, and John Frost referred to it as landing on top of panzer divisions, which, I don't. It depends how you define as landing on top of, but I think it shows that even two, vastly experienced and very highly regarded commanders perceived Arnhem very differently at distance, and I think that's perfectly understandable because Arnhem was obviously such a huge thing. But I think we can see how, even looking at this sort of 10-11 day period, that some of the seeds of the issues that would occur at Arnhem, you can already, in Market Garden, you can already see the disagreement with the air forces, the lack of consensus about how to use airborne forces, and possibly the air forces being a bit too careful, allied personality clashes. But I think one of the main things for me is that it's really a mistake to view airborne operations in isolation and to just consider the airborne part of an operation. You really need to place them in context of what else is going on. So, I mean, Perch, when you consider Wild Oats, feels very feels in a different context, and vice versa with Wild Oats and Perch. So I think it's always worth looking at what else is going on, what things are going on that we might not know about. And I think it goes back to Simon True's point. There's always new ways of looking at things we already know, or finding new sources that tell us new things. Yeah.
No, thank you, James. And folks, you know what to do. Go and buy the book, and we'll do some questions. And I think you've got me thinking, James, about also the fact that an airborne operation, by kind of definition, is all in, isn't it? I mean, okay, it may take multiple drops to bring them in, as it did of Market Garden, but it's kind of all or nothing. Whereas we know that when a ground unit is deployed, it's typically kind of, 1 brigade up, 2 brigades back, or 2 brigades up, 1 brigade. You can't kind of easily lose a ground division in one fell swoop. A lot would have to go wrong. But as you said at the beginning, with an airborne division, as we know at Market Garden, you can pretty much lose an airborne division in a matter of days. So, and it's not like the Allies have lots of spare airborne divisions up their sleeve to just replace the first ones. There's a couple of kind of individual American PIRs around, and there's recruits coming through the British system. There's the Poles, I guess, independent, but it's not a resource. There's a massive, great surfeit sitting there behind. So when you use it, you've got to, again, it's that getting that balance between something bold enough to warrant their use, but getting in quickly to make it worthwhile, but not something that risks losing that asset that you've got for that really important thing. It's a hard thing to get right when to deploy one division.
Yeah, and I think that's one of my abiding things, aside from thinking about what operations would or wouldn't have worked, is I wouldn't want to be one of these commanders or staff officers planning all of this, and we've got 80 years worth of hindsight looking at it. They're almost working it out. They're working out the policy while they're also trying to fight it. Whereas tanks, for example, have had since World War One and all of the benefit of the interwar period and all of that. Airborne in the British Army goes back to 1940. So it's important for us to remember they're trying to work something out on the go almost.
They're writing the doctrine as they go along. As the famous
much,
the title of the 101st Airborne's regimental or divisional history is A Rendezvous with Destiny, because they're kind of writing their history as they go. There is no model to look at in advance. This is the first use of airborne divisions in World War II. So it's that doctrine has to start somewhere. But we'll go back and deal with some of the questions. Some of them go back to stuff you're talking about at the beginning, but we'll go through. So Ian Carr was asking, were more Horsa gliders available this soon after D-Day for these operations that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they certainly had enough Horsa gliders at this point to consider doing a divisional operation. I think the issue would have been what happened after that, because the original plan is that 6th Airborne were only going to be in Normandy for a matter of weeks. As we know, Montgomery didn't really like letting go of airborne divisions once he got them, which degraded them in terms of reinforcing them. So there would have been enough for Wild Oats, but I think glider production wasn't fast enough to replenish what had been used on D-Day and what might have been used in Wild Oats. Certainly, replacing gliders is a big factor in the planning of some of these operations. And they, even before D-Day, they're planning what can we do based on what we know the throughput is of glider production, and gliders are a big part of this.
Thank you. We're getting questions about the proposed Brittany judge, but I think what we'll do is bring you back on to go through that again, because if you want to come back, because there's a lot of potential there. I mean, to give an example of what's coming in, Rob Crane is saying, I'm intrigued that some of the British shops were around Brittany, which is where Bradley was meant to go. Would that have used British Airborne with US ground forces? I mean, yes, basically, wouldn't it?
Yeah, because the 1st Airborne Division were the only airborne forces that the Allies had available at that time, because the 82nd and 101st are either still in Normandy or have just come back. So all of those operations would have included at least the 1st Airborne Division. Some of them might have included a regimental combat team or the Poles. And just as a bit of a taster, there's one operation, at least one, that would have seen Browning coming under the command of Patton, which is quite an intriguing concept, isn't it? The Grenadier Guard and the Yeah,
there's two personalities that seem to have nothing in common. They're both men, and they both got 2 arms and 2 legs. That's about it. It's
It's hard not to sort of think what would have happened there.
Another one relating to the that route that took it in towards Falaise. So Gary was saying, does James think that Falaise was recognised as a possible German retreat route, i.e., cut them off? Because we all know, obviously, that the Falaise pocket happened. Do you think the Falaise had kind of been identified earlier as like a potential retreat route, as the question is there?
It's difficult not to see Falaise as being key, isn't it? When you look at it being on that major road from Caen, if you control Falaise, basically anything to the west of it is either cut off in very serious risk of being cut off. I think so. I think Falaise has clearly been identified as being key. I don't know whether they foresaw the Falaise pocket, because I think the assumptions before D-Day were that the Germans would withdraw in an orderly fashion. We know that's not what actually happened, but in any scenario in the Battle of Normandy, I think Falaise is key, whether that's forming a pocket or whether that's forming a block or whatever. I think the fact that it comes up in those airborne operations before D-Day again is indicative of how important it was.
Well, and the fact that the Dives River, along with the Odon and the Orne, they all kind of obviously run north-south. They are going to be involved at some point to get the army east. They're going to have to at some point get across those bridges, and bridges do have that kind of big airborne connection, which is fascinating. Does James think, Andrew here, that 1st Airborne were chomping at the bit even at this early stage? I got the feeling they were driving 30 Corps, is Andrew's comment.
Airborne, the 1st Airborne were champing at the bit. I mean, at least one veteran referred to the division almost mutinying on D-Day because they were gutted they didn't take part. So clearly they were up for it. Clearly they were up for it. And after one of the operations, I think it's Transfigure later on in the campaign, Browning has to send a memo to the whole division telling them, I'm sorry you've been let down so many times, but when you get used, you'll be used decisively. So they're clearly getting themselves really worked up for it. I don't think that's in question at all. There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm, and there's all these stories about defaulters and people who were sick suddenly coming back and suddenly having Damascene recovery so they could take part in the operation. So the enthusiasm's there. In terms of driving 30 Corps, I don't know 30 Corps specifically, because the Airborne Division theoretically could be used with whichever corps or army that it might be needed to. But the airborne as a concept is definitely playing on commanders' minds. They know they've got this resource. They know it's been expensively put together and trained. You've got Browning, who's very ambitious. I don't think that's a secret. And you've also got, in America, you've got Marshall and Arnold, who are pushing Eisenhower to do creative and imaginative things, in some places foolhardy things. So as a general concept, airborne is weighing on commanders' thinking, clearly.
I'm looking at how many questions we've got. We're going to have to bring you back, otherwise we're going to be here till next Thursday. But
I can answer some of them on YouTube later.
Sure, that'd be good. Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about in the swiftness with which some of these plans didn't happen is the weather, of course, because you're talking about that period 11 days after D-Day. So it's just when I'm guessing the meteorological departments are starting to warn of the bad front that brought that storm on June 19th. So Gary is saying, was weather a factor in some of these operations not happening?
Not these ones in Normandy, but it certainly does come up in other operations. I mean, airborne operations, you've got wind, you've got cloud cover in terms of if any flying takes place at night, you've got what the moon state is. In some operations, not necessarily in Normandy, but in other places, you've got flooding. So Walker, and when they're looking at that, it's heavily flooded. There are so many factors that come into this. One of the operations in Brittany, they're planning to land on the beach, so that has to take place at low tide. And when you add it to all of these different hoops you've got to jump through to get airborne forces into action, it's a very it's quite a tall order to get an airborne operation going, I think.
And Peter, thank you. And Peter is kind of adding to what we said earlier about the fact the 82nd, the 101st, and the 6th are already deployed. There aren't many paratroopers left. And so given that the 82nd, the 101st, the 6th are going to receive losses in Normandy, it's kind of, was it even feasible to send in, or maybe a better word is, too much of a risk to send in another airborne division when you might really, really, really need them? I mean, the question is, anything we've proposed tonight, how absolutely fundamental to the winning of the Normandy campaign was it? Was it just the swiftness of potentially bringing a swifter end, or was it pivotal? Because as we said, if you end up losing the 1st Airborne Division, you've now got nothing. You've spent everything. You've got to now wait, and you've got to bring the divisions already deployed back and try and bring them up to strength again for something else. It's potentially high risk.
Absolutely, and I think again it's that sort of contrast of, it's got to be ambitious enough to be worthwhile, but it can't be too risky that you're going to lose them. And the original idea before D-Day, certainly from the British part, was that the 6th Airborne would be in Normandy for a couple of weeks, then they would come back to refit. 1st Airborne would probably do an op in a couple of weeks, and between them they would rotate. So they would take part in an operation maybe a week or two, then they'd come back. Where 6th Airborne spends so long in Normandy, that really throws out the scenario, because in the original planning scenario before D-Day, 1st Airborne and 6th Airborne would have taken turns as the readiness division, so to speak, which would have allowed the other one to refit, train, or whatever. So it means that 1st Airborne Division are on standby for all of these. So Montgomery keeping 6th Airborne in the bridgehead until late August really throws out a lot of the planning assumptions.
I mean, that's a really good point. And, as we know from Band of Brothers with the 101st, give us 5 days of hard fighting and you will be relieved. And they end up spending a month there. The 82nd always were meant to be staying a bit longer to be part of 7th Corps putting west. But you say the 6th Airborne were not supposed to be there, as they ended up being there for 3 months. It was meant to be a lot of a shorter a stay, which is why this show is so fantastic. It's opening up a spider's web of potential discussions. But one couple of points. So Trevor's making the point, long-range planning does not deal with future decisions, but with the future of present decisions. Peter Drucker, that probably applies here too. So just Trevor adding some words of wisdom there, which was worth hearing from. And then the last question we'll deal with from David O'Keefe. Were there any operations that were thrown together in a hasty fashion to close the Falaise Gap, particularly around the area of the Mace? I mean, that's a big question potentially. But anything you discovered?
None that I found, which doesn't mean that they're not there somewhere. And of course, I've only found things that were written down. It doesn't mean that there weren't things that were discussed. Like as we said before, things that might have been discussed in the pub, so to speak. But no, I think once the front solidifies in Normandy, I think there's almost an unwritten assumption that the time's passed for airborne forces. And then by the time the front opens up again around Cobra, Bluecoat, that period, I think then the Allies are advancing so fast that it becomes hard to identify how far ahead that makes it ambitious and how close that makes it achievable. And they're also, at that time, they're also looking at Brittany quite a lot. So really, after Wild Oats, that's the end of airborne planning for Normandy, as far as I found.
Oh, brilliant. Well, we discussed before going live, folks. Jeff McGovern wants to come back and do a show about the creation of the first Allied army and how it was used, and maybe it could have been used differently. I've invited James to be part of this, and maybe David O'Keefe would like to be a third person to give the Canadian point of view, because that would be a really fantastic conversation about August and how that changes the game yet again, with how airborne forces are utilized, how they're organized, how they're commanded. There's the whole Brereton factor there, because that would make a fantastic discussion in August, although I think we might have to allow more than an hour for that one. That'd be like a 6 hour one with a break in the middle for a pee, possibly. I don't know, but if you're happy to come back from that, we'll plan that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, brilliant. Let's leave it there. So, folks, let's say you've got a day off for me tomorrow, but I'm back on Thursday. We've got 2 shows. We've got one about the V1 threat and the Gloucester Meteors used with Donald. Then in the evening, we've got a Guadalcanal show about the 53 days of Marine Corps aviation there, which I'm looking forward to. But thanks for your fantastic questions tonight. We couldn't get to all of them, but we'll just save them up for when we bring James back in the future. So thanks for watching, everybody. Thank you, James. And I will see you on Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.